Good evening. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad we have the Bible. The Bible is a book of unspeakable beauty, correct? And the Bible is a book of unspeakable horror, correct? Yeah, we don't like to think about that part so much, but there are some very difficult stories in the Bible. And what we need in the world today is a little more of the beauty and a little less of the horror. So listen carefully this evening. When I was a kid, I really liked the song Dare to be a Daniel. That was one of my favorites. We would sing that every Friday during our JMV meetings. And I thought, I want to be that courageous, stand up in the face of danger, just like Daniel and his friends. And when I was introduced to the story of Esther, that got my attention. I was thinking that Esther was an amazing risk taker. When she decided to go see the king without an invitation, she said, "If I perish, I perish." And I thought, wow, could I actually just hold my life out on the line like that sometime? And just say, I'm going to do this, and no matter what happens, I am resolved. Well, I was quite inspired by that, and I wanted to be like Esther as well. When I got older, I reread the story of Esther, and it's not quite the pretty story that I had thought as a child. I won't go into real graphic details, but if you remember, it starts off rather rough with her being essentially kidnapped, along with many other virgins, and taken into the citadel, where she was given 1 year of training on how to please the king, and she had one night with him to do that. Now, his decision on who was going to be queen was based on his pleasure with whichever girl was in for that night. It's a rather grim story, but that's how it worked. And whether she was chosen or not, she was doomed to become part of his petting zoo called a harem for the rest of her life. So it's not a fun story for Esther, even the way it starts off. But then it gets more challenging. She actually is chosen to be the queen. And then a number of things unfold in rapid succession. And it's an amazingly tightly written story with all kinds of intrigue and turnarounds and surprises and plot twists and everything. So it's an incredible story, but the thing that makes it so messy for me is not the beginning. It's more the ending of the story. It's theologically messy. Because as you remember, Haman succeeds in getting the king to give his stamp of approval for the annihilation of Jews across the entire empire. Now, this empire was large. It stretched from India to North Africa. It had 127 different provinces. They had to create a special breed of horses to be able to run fast enough just to get news out across the empire. And so those horses were sent with a royal decree that on a particular day chosen by Lot, not Lot as in Abraham's relative, but through the casting of lots, it had fallen on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. And because the Jewish word for Lot is Pur, they now have a celebration called Purim, because there were casting of lots. And this celebration is about the amazing turnaround of the fate of the Jews. Because on that day, instead of the Jews being annihilated, they were able to annihilate many of their enemies. And the way I was told this story as a boy was that anybody coming to kill the Jews on that day, because the king's first edict could not be overturned, so he had to kind of give a second one, allowing them to defend themselves. And I was always taught to think of them as kind of sitting quietly in their homes, waiting, and then the bad people come up and they're able to shoot back, which was kind of an interesting thing because I was brought up in a very pacifistic home, and the idea of being able to kill somebody was quite amazing, but that's what the king gave them the permission to do. But as I read it now as an adult, it doesn't sound so much like the Jews waiting for people to come and attack them, because the language is pretty clear that they can go after anybody who hated them. Would you like that power given into the hands of people here tonight? Is there anybody here that might think that you hate them? Is there anybody here who might think that they would have the right to go after you? That's kind of the setup. Well, in that day of slaughter, the Jews managed to kill 75,000 people. But in the capital city, they kill 500. Well, you can call that self-defense because obviously Haman wanted to get rid of them. But remember, Haman's anger against the Jews was not because he didn't like Jews. It's because he didn't like Mordecai. And he wanted to get rid of everybody like Mordecai. So can we assume that the entire empire had that same kind of resentment that Haman had? Or were they just going to be carrying out the king's edict? And when they saw the Jews successfully fighting back, do you think that they would want to continue going in and volunteering themselves for extermination? It doesn't seem very likely. But here's the troubling part. The next day, the king comes back to Esther and says, "Is there anything else you would like?" And she says, "Well, yes, my cousin told me to make one more request. That is, can we extend the slaughter by another day?" Apparently one day was not enough. Now, I was never told that part of the story as a child. And I've watched some movies and plays about Esther, and I have never seen that part put into the story. It's messy theologically. Or maybe I'm the only one with a problem with that. So let's just go on to another story. Here's a man who looks like a friendly soul. His name is Dr. Baruch Goldstein. See how he's holding his hands carefully like a physician might? Well, he is a physician. And he grew up in the United States, but then he moved to Israel. And you'll notice the yellow star on his sweater. That begins to give you a little bit of a foreshadowing of what may be coming. This story happened only 25 years ago, long after the Holocaust. And yet he is putting a gold star, a yellow star, on his clothing, and it says Yud on there, because that's what the Jews were marked with during the time of the Nazi extermination of Jews. So he's carrying a bit of a chip on his shoulder, or his chest, as you might say. And that little twinkle in his eye must be reserved for his own kind, because in 1994 in Hebron, he committed the massacre in the Cave of the Patriarchs, killing 29 people and wounding 125. He was then beaten to death by the survivors, but he's now worshipped by other Jewish extremists. His tomb says he had clean hands and a pure heart. Well, where did he get his inspiration? Let's take a look at a website that's created by a rabbi to talk about the Esther story. And this may be difficult for you to read, especially when it's off the sides of the screen, so I'll read it for you. The issue of how we are to understand, and this is Rabbi Jill Jacobs on My Jewish Learning website. She says the issue of how we are to understand the ending of the Megillah. A Megillah is a scroll that's used to explain things. And when a Jewish person says the Megillah, they're talking about the scroll of Esther, because that is one of the most significant ones, the most significant scrolls of explanation that they have. So how are we to understand the ending of the Megillah? It's made more complex by the fact that on the Shabbat preceding Purim, Jews read Parshat Zachor, the story of the defeat of Amalek, an early enemy of the Jews and the nation that produced Haman, the villain of the Purim story. This reading concludes, and this is every year, this reading concludes with a command to wipe out Amalek in every generation. Now the juxtaposition, or the putting together side by side, of the reading of Parshat Zachor with the reading of the Megillah transforms Purim's story from a one-time event to a paradigm for using violence to respond to any opponent. Kind of a sobering thought. In recent years, some have likened the Palestinians to Amalek, and as such have justified any violence against this people. It is no coincidence that Baruch Goldstein, a fanatical Jewish settler in the West Bank, chose Purim Day to carry out his 1994 massacre of the Palestinian worshippers in Hebron. When equated by those of a certain political viewpoint to the contemporary Jewish experience, the Purim story becomes an incitement to violence and not simply a satire about a distant time and place. So I'm not the only one that has paid attention to the end of that story, and it's chilling to think that some people take the ending as being a blessing to go thou and do likewise. But I think the problem is that aggression runs pretty deep in the heart of each person. We have this delight in revenge. And it's kind of understandable because when we become terrified, we want relief. And sometimes relief from terror comes through annihilating whatever was terrifying us. That's what we would call revenge. And to remove that then causes relief and joy and celebration to us. But we have to be careful with that. Now, did you notice, or have you ever put these two ideas together, that Esther ends with a very violent continuation of their annihilation of their enemies, but God's name is never used in that book? Now, we've all heard that, but why? Why is God's name never used in the book of Esther? And it's not just the fact that they assume God in the story, and so they didn't bother to name him, but there are a couple of times when he is painfully absent. Like when Mordecai hears that this decree has been made to exterminate the Jews, he begins to grieve and to mourn and to wail, and he puts on sackcloth and ashes on his head, and he fasts. Normally you hear of fasting and prayer, but he just fasts. And before Esther goes in and takes that big risk of approaching the king without an invitation, a crime punishable by death, she tells Mordecai to tell all of the Jews in Susa for 3 days and nights to fast. Again, no mention of prayer. There is no mention that God was ever sought for a solution to their problems. Now, because they were so wonderfully delivered, and because our hearts are with the Jewish people, we assume that God was behind all of that, but God's name was never used in that book. And I wonder if, when God was inspiring that writer, he says, you can tell the story, just don't get me tangled up with it because it's messy. I don't know. It's a question that I have. But there is this bloody problem of aggression. And when we feel like we have the right to go after somebody, it just feels morally right. And so we have to take some caution from some of the other verses in the Bible. The one in Proverbs 14:12 apparently was so important that it gets repeated just 2 chapters later. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. I think more importantly, Jeremiah tells us, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Well, people have tried to know the human heart, and they have come up with all kinds of theories for why we act the way we do. So let's take a look at Albert Bandura. I'm sure many of you have read some of his things. He was very active in social psychology, and he talked about social cognitive theory. He said that there are at least 8 ways that we disengage our moral restraint. Now, we have to become morally restrained to get along as a society. The might makes right morality of little children cannot help a community survive. I can't simply say, if I'm strongest, I get to take what I want, even if it's yours. We have to get rid of that. So we train that out of our children. And as adults, we think, I don't want anybody to see me that way. And so we become cautious in the way we present ourselves to other people. We have a conscience. We have a sense of propriety, a sense of self-respect. But sometimes we still want our own way. And so Bandura says we've got at least 8 ways to get around our self-restraint and justify going after what we want. You ready for the list? Moral justification. This one is used in all holy wars. We can feel good about doing what we want to do, even if it involves bloodshed, if we can say that we have a moral reason for doing it. Several times in the Bible, you've seen people say, well, it's better that one person die instead of the nation. Sometimes that was said to kind of explain why Jesus died, but other times it was used other ways. So that's one way. It's morally better. In my first year of teaching, I began to realize that this is a prime way that parents sometimes excuse the way they behave. Now, you may think, okay, don't dump on parents. I don't want to dump on parents. I am a parent. Most of us here are parents, or we're children of parents and will end up being parents. So I'm just talking about a dynamic, not a group. But in my first year of teaching, I was not a parent. And I would see people come in who are normally very good people who would suddenly fly into a rage when their child was involved. I would think, how can they do that? How can they? And they would tell me this flat out. They would say, if it was just for me, I wouldn't make it an issue. But when my child's involved, and then it was like they had an excuse to do whatever they wanted because the primary moral value in that moment was defending their child. Isn't it right to defend your children? Absolutely, but not in the way they were proposing. And I sometimes wanted to say, did Jesus say, love your enemies except when your child is involved? Did he ever say that you'll be judged by every word that comes out of your mouth, except if you're speaking on behalf of your child? Did Jesus give us a wild card saying, your child will get you off the hook for any kind of indecency or aggression? I can't find that in the Bible. So this is a moral disengagement when we claim that we're acting on somebody's behalf, and that gives us the right to act in a way that we normally wouldn't act. That's moral justification. Another one, victim attribution. This is where we say that the victim had it coming. They deserved everything they got. She was asking for it. He shouldn't be so annoying. I hear this from kids. Well, why did you do that? He's just so annoying. They can't stand it. And so they think that somehow that person's behavior gives them the right to behave in a way that we've told them they can't behave. It's victim attribution. Another one is euphemistic labeling, giving a better title for something to sugarcoat it a little bit. The military will talk about neutralizing a target. They will not, say we went in and massacred people. They'll say we controlled the situation. They give it a clean thing. It was a precise surgical strike. And we think that, oh, good, only the worst fingertips or the baddest people got hurt. And we don't think of the bombs flying and the shrapnel going all over the place and some innocent people being hurt as well, because we have this clean hospital kind of language to use for war. That's euphemistic labeling. Advantageous comparison is when we say, what I did was wrong, but I can make it look a lot better by making the other person look even worse. So if I can compare my behavior to a much worse behavior, then mine's not so punishable. Another one is displacement of responsibility. We saw this a lot in the Nazi war trials, because those people said, I was just doing as I was told. I didn't want particularly to hurt the Jewish people, but I was under orders. We were in war. I was commanded to do that, and I was going to be very effective at what I did. So they claimed the responsibility lies somewhere else. I was faithful. And I don't know if this exactly fits in here, but when I look at the gangs in Southern California, I notice that one of their top values is loyalty. They'll have the big word faithful tattooed on their neck or their shoulders, or they'll say loyalty or things like that. And loyalty, being a top value, means I am free to do whatever I need to if somebody in my group needs that help. If somebody in my group has asked me to do that, I'm free to do that because loyalty is more important than anything else. That may be moral justification, but it's also displacing the responsibility for my own behavior. Diffusion of responsibility. This is where kind of things are going chaotically, and we think during this time maybe we're not going to be held accountable. Like when a riot breaks out and people start looting stores, has nothing to do with the issue that caused the riot. But once the riot begins, then, hey, I've always wanted that refrigerator. Can you imagine? I mean, sometimes people have actually broken into a store and carried off a refrigerator. Who's going to stop them, huh? So I see this in kids, too. You're like, well, how did this happen? Well, I don't know. Everything was just kind of crazy, and then it happened. We don't know where it started. It just, things were going weird. So that's diffusion of responsibility. Now, disregarding or misrepresenting injurious consequences. This is where you kind of downplay what's going to happen, or you don't want to know. I would imagine, again, going back to the Second World War, when they were doing experiments on people and trying to graft an arm on where a leg should be and that kind of thing, they probably just didn't care to know about the outcome of that for people once they got the data that they wanted. So you downplay or disregard the consequences, and then you can sleep at night. And the last one is dehumanization. Dehumanization often begins with changing the name of somebody. This is often why in prisons a person may be referred to by a number. They're not a real person, after all. They committed a crime. They're in here for a reason. We'll give them a number. We don't want to know about their family. We don't want to know about their background or anything else. They're simply prisoner number 259. We saw this in a very freakish experiment in Stanford University in 1973 or 4, I think, called the Stanford Prison Trials. And Philip Zimbardo was trying to find out what was going wrong in American prisons at that time. And so he set up a prison in the basement of the psychology building, School of Psychology, and he had students randomly selected to be the prisoners or the guards. He was going to run the experiment for 2 weeks, but in 1 week it was getting so horrible and the abuse of the prisoners was so bad, and he was so bought into it, collecting data, he wasn't going to even end the experiment until his girlfriend said, if you don't end it, we're done. And that kind of snapped him out of it, and he said, oh, okay. And he ended the experiment, and it took him years to write up the results. And only recently, after the Abu Ghraib atrocities, when the U.S. government asked him to go in and tell them what on earth happened there, he took that old experiment out and he wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect. Because he said, I have found the way that aggression starts and how it builds up to murderous proportions. And it often starts with dehumanizing somebody else, referring to them by a different name. That's why name calling in school is important. We can't allow that to happen. So those are 8 moral disengagements that are rather interesting. Well, people have been doing research on that for a long time, and here's an interesting picture. Notice the ones that turned red. These are the ones that boys in school, like in basic education, K through 12, these are the ones that those boys are most likely to use. And girls, not so much. And in fact, when they've done the research on bullying, the 2 that stand out with a significant correlation to the carrying out of bullying acts are the underlined ones, moral justification and victim attribution. Those are the ones. Now, I was really surprised that they didn't talk a little bit more about girl bullying, because girls are certainly getting in on the act today through excluding other people and through making them look socially weak or bad. And I would imagine it would be somewhere up there in those first 2 also. She doesn't belong here. She's a misfit. I don't know why she came to this school, etc., etc. Well, how can we get out of that? Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, if only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. He says, wouldn't that be a simple life? I one time went with my son to a paintball fighting range. Not something I was brought up to do, but I saw that he was doing that with his friends. He kept saying, Dad, let's go paintballing. I said, well, okay. I went out. It was kind of scary being out in the woods with the different bunkers and stuff there and our camouflage gear on and our guns. And we were going through there and watching for the enemy team. And as soon as you saw them, there was no question of what you were to do. You weren't to negotiate. You were to shoot them so that you wouldn't get shot. It was very clear. And at that time, I was reading the stories of Moses and of David, and a lot of things that they were involved in were pretty cut and dried as well. And I went back to the faculty that I was working with at the time, and all of the intriguing little social things that were going on there. And in one faculty meeting, I just said, I understand why paintballing is so attractive. You know who the bad guys are. We sit around this table, and it's not so clear. But we're shooting at each other all the time. It was a very fractured faculty. We're shooting at each other all the time, but I can't call anybody here a clear enemy or a clear friend, you know? So Solzhenitsyn, fortunately, continues his statement. He says, this is a kind of an image that might stand for somebody who has really made a study of being righteous and looking at the Gentiles there having their party and saying they must be the evil ones. But he goes on and he says, but the dividing line, or the line dividing good and evil, cuts through the heart of every human being. So he would draw the graphic a little more like this. Does that ring true for you? Have you ever thought that you pretty well had it figured out and you were feeling really righteous for a day or half a day even? And then at some point something came up and suddenly you go, oh Lord, I thought I had that one mastered. And here it is still in my heart. Or here's this little voice whispering in my ear and I don't know where that lizard came from. That's not what I want to be. That's not how I want to think. We continue to fight the enemy in our hearts. Well, I think that Jesus says the same thing. He talks about aggression, and he places this problem within us. He said, you have heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's definitely the Esther story. Stand up for your own people, annihilate those who would annihilate you. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. God is not yet in the business of separating the tares and the wheat, or the sheep and the goats, and Jesus told us we're not to be about that business either. Again, this is from the New King James Version, and the translators put this heading in here, murder begins in the heart. You have heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Racha, or empty-headed person, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. As a child, I couldn't understand that. But now looking at Bandura and realizing this is the beginning of dehumanizing somebody, to call somebody a fool, a contemptible person, no value left, is the beginning of setting yourself up to do them violence. Well, here's something else to think about. You've heard of fight and flight, and we don't know what or when to do which. We come up to a certain situation, we feel under threat, or somebody that we love is being threatened, and we wonder, what do I do? Wade in there and just let them have it? Do I defend this person that I love against this person that I now don't like? That's the fight response. Or do I try to get away from the situation and just pretend I didn't see it? I don't know how to deal with it. I don't like the feelings that are coming up in me. That's the flight response. But is there a possible third alternative? I don't know if fix is a good one, but I have heard of people who say we need to be a non-anxious presence. That is hard, to stay in a situation that is anxiety producing, but be praying for God's help not to be anxious, so that you can keep your eyes open, your ears open, and watch for an opportunity. Now, did Jesus ever give us an example of how to do that? I don't know, but Walter Wink thinks he did. Walter Wink wrote a book called The Third Alternative, or I think that's a subtitle. The title is Jesus and Nonviolence. Because some people say this world cannot operate from a nonviolent point of view. Walter Wink spends the first part of his book saying, here are all the different things, wars and revolutions that have happened since the Second World War. He kind of catalogs them and shows how many were fought non-violently and how effective they were and how many lives were spared compared to those that were fought violently. So he says just from empirical evidence, the non-violent approach works better. It puts the people with the conviction on the firing line. Gandhi put himself at risk, and he asked people who believed in the cause to put themselves at risk, and they did that. We don't do that when we declare war on another country. The people making the declaration know they will be safe. They're not going out to fight. They're signing a bill that sends young people off to fight. And so Walter Wink points out some of those things in his book. But does Jesus himself talk about that? Here's what Wink thinks is an example of Jesus' nonviolent invitation. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." And you know what Gandhi said, if we keep living by that, soon the whole world will be blind and toothless. Jesus continues, "But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And the way Walter Wink unpacks this, and you can disagree with him, I don't know that I agree. But I am not smart enough or well enough educated on this to argue, so I'll just let you know what he says. He says Matthew identifies this correctly. Luke talks about this, but he doesn't say right cheek. He just says, whoever strikes you on the cheek. Luke was farther from Jesus' sermons. Matthew heard them. So Matthew hears, whoever strikes you on the right cheek. The Jewish people believed strongly in being right-handed. It was considered a fault or a defect to be left-handed. The whole society was focused on right-handedness. So to hit somebody on the right cheek with your right hand implies slapping them the way you would a slave. That was a way to correct somebody who was below you. You'd slap them like that. So he's saying if somebody treats you like a slave, turn to him the other cheek. You stand, you don't run away, you don't fight back, you just say, what are you intending to do here? You're calling them to be accountable for what they just did to you. You're not fighting and you're not running. He also takes this section, says if somebody wants to take your tunic in court, you lose the case and they say, okay, hand over your tunic. And you say, okay, he can also take my cloak. That's your undergarments. And nudity was not such a big thing at that time as it is now, but that would be embarrassing to the person who is trying to take some of your clothing. You say, okay, take it all. Because you're emphasizing the fact you're trying to take me of something that's my personal property. And there were laws against keeping that overnight. So he says further, if somebody compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And the assumption here was that the Jews were often asked to carry the Romans' packs. But the Romans had set a limit on themselves, and they said, you can only do this for 1 mile. And so Jesus is saying, instead of fighting back or grumbling about it, go the 2nd mile to show them that you're choosing to do this. It takes the power away from them. They commanded you to do 1 mile. You do the next mile under your own steam, and that will help them see that you're still making your own decisions. That's how some people have interpreted this. So I come to the conclusion and I just ask, I wanted to be like Esther. I want her strength to stand up in the face of peril. I'm not sure that I want the end of that story. Esther was called for such a time as this, but Jesus was called in the fullness of time. And who are we called to be? Estherians or Christians?